Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, November 27th, 2023. All right, so the first story I want to go over today, it's actually not the top story on the page, but it is the most relevant when it comes to what happened over the weekend. I want to catch everybody up with the situation with this hostage deal and the truce. So this story says that Hamas says it wants to extend truce with Israel after the latest prisoner swap. So since Friday, since this ceasefire or pause, whatever you want to call it, came into effect, it has pretty much held. There's been Israeli fire on Palestinians who were trying to return to northern Gaza, displaced Palestinians who were trying to go back home. They were fired on, but besides that, I haven't seen any major violations of the ceasefire aspect of the deal, and they've been exchanging prisoners throughout the 3 days. So Hamas said on Sunday that it's ready to extend the 4-day truce with Israel after the two sides exchanged prisoners for the third straight day. Hamas said in a statement, quote, "The Islamic resistance movement Hamas seeks to extend the truce after the 4-day period ends through serious efforts to increase the number of those released from imprisonment as stipulated in the humanitarian ceasefire agreement," end quote. So the hostage deal allows an extension in the 4-day truce in exchange for Hamas releasing more hostages. Earlier in the day, a Hamas source told AFP that the group could potentially release 20 to 40 more Israelis. Qatar, which brokered the deal, said that Hamas does need to locate dozens of Israeli women and children who are being held in Gaza by other groups, not by Hamas. And Qatar is saying they need to do that in order to extend the pause in fighting. So the Israeli side has expressed interest in extending the 4-day truce if Hamas releases more prisoners, while making it clear that the war will continue once the pause is over. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke with President Biden on Sunday and said his government is willing to extend the ceasefire 1 day for every 10 hostages that Hamas releases. So Netanyahu said that he also told Biden that, quote, "At the end of the deal, we are returning to full power to carry out our aims, destroy Hamas, ensure that Gaza won't return to what it was, and of course, to free all of our hostages," end quote. So far, Hamas has released 58 hostages, including 14 Thai nationals. So 14 people from Thailand who are going back to Thailand. They were captured by Hamas during the October 7th attack. And they were released as part of a separate arrangement with Bangkok that was brokered by some other countries, a deal between Hamas and Thailand. 17 hostages were released on Sunday, including a 4-year-old American citizen. And Israel has released a total of 117 Palestinians, the majority being women and children, or people who were detained when they were minors and might not be minors anymore. On Saturday, Hamas said that it would stop releasing hostages. So this was kind of a brief hiccup in the situation. On Saturday, Hamas said that they were going to stop releasing hostages because Israel was not fulfilling its end of the commitment when it came to the aid. They said not enough aid trucks were coming into Gaza. And if you remember last week, I covered a story that said the U.S. did not believe that Israel could actually keep up its end of the deal when it came to the aid. They say they will allow 200 aid trucks per day. They said that would be very difficult if Israel didn't open one of its border crossings into Gaza, which they have refused to do. So I'm not sure the exact number of aid trucks that are coming in each day, but for a little while, for at least a few hours, Hamas said they were not going to continue because of the aid situation. But then later that day, they did release the hostages. So while the truce has held in Gaza, over in the West Bank, there's still been a lot of violence. And I know that this arrangement was not about the West Bank. There doesn't seem to be any, that there was any sort of deal when it came to the West Bank. Over the weekend, Israeli forces killed 8 people during raids in the West Bank, and that brings the total number of Palestinians killed over in the West Bank since October 7th to 239. So quite a bit. So you see what happens when people negotiate and they try diplomacy. There's results, and hopefully this ceasefire does extend. I can't imagine that it's going to extend beyond this deal when it comes to the hostage situation, but who knows? Hopefully there's some way that the pause in fighting continues. All right, so the next one here, and this is the top story at antiwar.com today. It says that Israel is killing Palestinian civilians at a historic pace. So the New York Times reported on Saturday that Israel is killing Palestinian civilians in Gaza at a historic pace. And this huge death toll in Gaza is explained by the scale of the bombing, as well as Israel's willingness to drop U.S.-provided 2,000-pound bombs on densely populated areas that are packed with civilians. So they're using U.S. weapons, U.S.-provided weapons funded by our tax dollars to kill civilians at this historic pace. And you'll know what it means by historic pace in a little bit here. But the Times quoted Mark Garlasco. He's a former Pentagon analyst who advises the Dutch NGO PAX. He said that he's never seen anything like this in his career, and that he said to find a historical comparison to the mass killing of civilians, you would have to go back to either Vietnam or the Second World War. And Israeli officials have frequently cited the Allied strategic bombings of Japan and Germany during World War II to justify their onslaught in Gaza. And in those bombing campaigns, it's estimated that between 600,000 civilians to up to into the millions. There's no exact death toll of how many German and Japanese civilians were killed by the Allies. But those are the numbers that we're talking about. Hundreds of thousands to the millions. And that includes the U.S. fire bombings of Japanese cities and the dropping of the atomic bomb. So these are the things that Israel is invoking. And Israel has also invoked the U.S. air campaign against ISIS, which killed tens of thousands of civilians in Iraq and Syria. But even the most brutal battle of that war does not compare to what Israel's doing in Gaza. According to an AP investigation, between 9,000 and 11,000 civilians died during the Battle of Mosul. About a third were killed by U.S.-led coalition airstrikes or Iraqi forces, and a third were killed by ISIS, and the cause of death for the rest is undetermined. So between 9,000 and 11,000 civilians killed by all sides. And the Battle of Mosul lasted for 9 months, from October 2016 to July 2017. In less than 2 months in Gaza, the Israeli bombardment has killed at least 10,000 civilians, and this is based on a conservative estimate that was cited by the New York Times, according to these experts that they spoke with. So the Israeli onslaught has also dwarfed the civilian casualties in the war in Ukraine since Russia invaded in February 2022. In 1 year and 9 months of fighting, the UN estimates that at least 10,000 civilians have been killed in Ukraine. 10,000. And that UN estimate is considered conservative. They believe the real number is higher, possibly significantly higher. But we're talking about conservative estimates for Ukraine and the conservative estimate for Gaza, both 10,000. And Gaza, it's been, I believe about 49 days now, not even 2 full months. And that UN estimate for Ukraine includes at least 560 children, again, in a year and 9 months. And the latest, the number of children in Gaza that have been killed is just unbelievable. And in this, I'm using very conservative estimates, and the last, sort of confirmed death toll that was released by Gaza's health ministry was put out on November 10th. And that was after just 35 days. And they said that over 4,500 Palestinian children were killed in those 35 days. And that was the day before, that was the day after, that the State Department admitted, after President Biden cast doubt on the death toll coming from Gaza's health ministry, then the State Department said, well, the real number is probably actually much higher because it doesn't account for the people dead that are under the rubble, or people who were buried before being brought to a hospital or a morgue. So what was considered a conservative estimate on November 10th, 4,500 children compared to 560 children killed in Ukraine. So despite the massive civilian and child death toll, the U.S. continues to provide Israel with unconditional military aid. The White House has acknowledged that many, many thousands of innocent people are being killed by Israel, but there's still no red lines. Okay, so the next one here, Biden moves to lift restrictions on Israel's access to U.S. weapons. So President Biden is looking to remove restrictions on Israel's access to weapons and ammunition that's stored in a U.S. stockpile located in Israel. This was reported by The Intercept on Saturday. So the U.S. military maintains a reserve stockpile of weapons and ammunition in Israel known as the War Reserve Stockpile Allies Israel. And I've spoken about this stockpile before. This was the U.S. dipped into this to send artillery shells to Ukraine, and now they're replenishing the stockpile with artillery shells that were initially going to go to Ukraine, but they diverted them to replenish this stockpile. And so the White House wants to lift all the restrictions pretty much that are on Israel's access to this stockpile, because it's a U.S. military-controlled stockpile that's in Israel, but the U.S. still has control of it. And this was included in the emergency supplemental funding request that the White House made to Congress on October 20th, which is for that $105 billion to fund military aid for Israel, Ukraine, and also Taiwan. And what this would do is that under the current restrictions, the U.S. can only transfer weapons and ammunition to this stockpile that are obsolete or surplus. So you can't send things over there that the U.S. military might need. But this is saying this would lift that restriction, and it would allow the transfer of all categories of defense articles. The request would also scrap the requirement for Israel to make certain concessions to access the stockpile. That's kind of a vague requirement as it is. They say Israel has to make concessions to access the stockpile. Not clear what that means, but this would get away with those concessions. It would give the Pentagon greater flexibility in determining the value of the concessions provided in exchange for the transfers. It would also reduce congressional oversight by eliminating the requirement of providing 30-day notice before a weapons transfer, and would also do away with a $200 million annual cap on spending to replenish this stockpile. So Josh Paul, who recently resigned from the State Department over President Biden's full support for this war in Gaza, he told The Intercept that this would essentially create a free-flowing pipeline to provide any weapon to Israel by the simple act of placing them in this stockpile. So basically, this would give the U.S. the ability to put any kind of weapon, anything you could possibly think of, in this stockpile, then Israel can grab it and use it in Gaza. So this is what Biden is trying to do. And we'll see. Congress still hasn't passed. The House passed a version of the $14 billion for Ukraine that include the lifting of this restriction. The Senate, I think, is expected to vote on some Ukraine and Israel aid. It doesn't look like they're going to go for the full $105 billion package, but they want to keep funding the war in Ukraine and the war in Israel, obviously, the war in Gaza. All right, the next one here, Israeli, October 7th, Posterchild was killed by an Israeli tank. So this article is from the Gray Zone from Max Blumenthal, and it says that eyewitnesses say that this 12-year-old Israeli girl, who was used by the Israeli government for propaganda value, saying that she was burned beyond recognition by Hamas, this eyewitness says that she was actually killed by an Israeli tank. And this witness is a woman named Yasmin Porat, who actually gave an interview last month. That was the first real piece of evidence that I saw that indicated Israel was responsible for some of the civilian casualties during the October 7th attack. And in this interview that she did on November 15th with Israel's Khan broadcaster, she gets more into detail. And basically what she says is that, so she was at the music festival, and when it came under attack, she fled to the nearby kibbutz Be'eri, where a lot of fighting happened between Israel and Hamas. And she said that they were in a house with their Hamas captors, and that the Hamas fighters thought that they were surrounded by Israeli troops, which she said wasn't the case. She said they probably could have been able to get back into Gaza. But anyway, because of that, they wanted to try to negotiate their exit. They called for the Israeli police. Israeli special forces finally arrived on the scene, and she was taken out by one of the Hamas captors who came out and used her as a human shield as he walked out. And while he was out there, she was trying to explain to the commander of the Israeli military unit where the hostages were and where the Hamas fighters were. But then they ended up, after a gun battle, they called in a tank and just started firing on the house. And she said, according to one of the survivors that she spoke with, immediately after that was in the house, most of the Israeli hostages were killed by the Israeli tank fire, including this 12-year-old girl. So go check out the article. It has a lot more details about her story. Again, which really just tells a different story than what the Israeli government is trying to have everybody believe about October 7th. All right, so the next one here, Israel bombs Damascus airport out of service. So Israel has bombed the Damascus airport in Syria again. And this was reported by Syria's state news agency on Sunday. A source told them that the Israeli military bombed the Damascus airport at 4:50 on Sunday afternoon and put it out of service. And Israel has been bombing Syria's airports a lot since October 7th, but they actually began targeting them last year. In the summer of 2022 is when they really started hitting both the Aleppo and Damascus international airports quite frequently. So, a lot of people might see this and assume this is related to the current flare-up, but this is something Israel has been doing for a long time. Now, since October 7th, they've done this quite a bit. And actually, I didn't realize Israel bombed the Damascus airport so heavily in October that it was actually out of service for about a month. And it resumed service early Sunday and was just bombed again just a few hours later by the Israeli military. And Israel justifies its airstrikes on Syria's airports by claiming they receive Iranian weapon shipments. Who knows how much truth there is to that, but even if they do receive weapon shipments, does that mean Israel's airports are open could be bombed because they receive U.S. weapon shipments? That's the logic that they're using here. And they're also civilian airports. There's no doubt that they're used for civilian flights as well. And earlier this year, after that devastating earthquake hit northwest Syria and Turkey, it killed thousands of Syrians. Israel bombed the Aleppo airport and they put it out of service, and they cut off aid deliveries to the Aleppo airport. So that's what they've been doing to Syria. They've been bombing Syria with impunity for years, quite a bit, quite frequently. Before October 7th, Israel bombed Syria 25 times just this year. All right, so the next one here, missiles and drones are among arms stolen from the U.S. in Iraq and Syria. So this article is from Nick Turse at The Intercept, and it's really something. It says that U.S. military outposts in Iraq and Syria are plagued by thefts of weapons and equipment, according to exclusive documents obtained by The Intercept that show militias and criminal gangs are systematically targeting U.S. forces. Military investigations launched earlier this year found that multiple sensitive weapons and equipment, including guided missile launch systems as well as drones, have been stolen from Iraq. And this follows hundreds of thousands of dollars in military gear that were purloined from U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria between 2020 and 2022. So that is a lot of theft. Weapons are being stolen straight out of the bases. Missiles, it's unbelievable. And it goes to show, as Terse, the point he makes in this piece, as these bases are coming under attack and the U.S. is claiming that they're protecting the troops there, if they can't protect the bases from theft of this scale, there's no way that they can really say that they're protecting the U.S. troops who are at these bases in Iraq and Syria, who are just basically sitting ducks to pay for Biden's support for what Israel's doing in Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Lebanese return to find bombed out houses near Israel border. This is an article from AFP, and basically it's just about how Lebanese people are returning to southern Lebanon because there has been relative calm at the border. That means Israel and Hezbollah have not really been firing at each other since the truce took effect in Gaza. There was some reports of an exchange of fire early Saturday morning, but besides that, it's been much calmer, which is good because if that escalates into a full-blown Israel-Lebanon war, that means the U.S. is getting sucked in. So at least there's been some calm. I think hopefully this lasts, even if things do ramp up again in Gaza, that the situation on the northern border, because that's what really risks dragging the U.S. into a direct war in the region, is if that situation really escalates. All right, so the next one here is a huge story. Ukraine confirms an early peace deal was possible. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone, and it says that David Arakhamia, who's a high-ranking member of Zelensky's Servant of the People Party, has confirmed that Kiev could have ended the war with Russia after a month if it agreed not to join NATO. So Arakhamia was leading the Ukrainian delegation in peace talks with Russia in March 2022 when they met in Istanbul, and negotiations continued into April virtually. And at the time, it was very clear that Russia's main demand was Ukrainian neutrality. Say you're not going to join NATO. There was also other things about denazification, demilitarization that was very vague. But he says in this interview with a Ukrainian TV channel, he says that other stuff wasn't really important. It was all about the neutrality. He said, quote, "They really hoped almost to the last moment that they would force us to sign such an agreement so that we would take neutrality. It was the most important thing for them. They were prepared for an end to the war if we agreed to neutrality and committed that we would not join NATO," end quote. He said everything else was simply rhetoric and political seasoning, talking about the denazification and that stuff. He also explained that Kiev was unlikely to accept Putin's offer during the talks in Istanbul because Ukrainian leadership did not believe Russia could be trusted. However, he went on to say that then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson cemented Kiev on the path of fighting a long war with Russia. So essentially what he says is, we probably couldn't trust Russia, although there was supposed to be some sort of security guarantees. But the crux here is that he is confirming that Boris Johnson went over to Kiev in April 2022, which was reported by Ukrainian media, and said that they don't want to sign a deal. He said, quote, "Moreover, when we returned from Istanbul, Boris Johnson came to Kiev and said that we would not sign anything with them at all, and let's just fight," end quote. So again, this is huge. This is the lead negotiator on the Ukrainian side confirming what we all knew, from a bunch of other sources, but confirming it as the Ukrainian official that was there leading things, that Boris Johnson came over, representing NATO and the U.S. essentially, and saying, even if you want to sign a peace deal with Russia, we don't. Continue the war. And what has happened since then? The offer that was on the table was neutrality for a Russian withdrawal. And the U.S., NATO didn't want to do it. They didn't want Ukraine to do it. And now here we are almost 2 years later. And how many people are dead? Hundreds of thousands killed. Ukraine's never going to get those territories back. And again, there's been a lot of sources on confirming this. The Ukrainian media report. There was a report in Foreign Affairs that said a deal was on the table. Turkey said that they believed that basically NATO wanted to continue the war to weaken Russia. And then that was what Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said around the time was one of the goals of the war was to weaken Russia. So it's very clear that the U.S. wanted this war to continue, and that's what they got. And this is where we are now. So it's just really, I think this should be. We had this up over the weekend, but this is such a huge story. It should be everywhere, but of course it's not everywhere. The fact that the U.S. and NATO wanted to sabotage peace and that a deal was really on the table should be huge. And now the next story is about the consequences of that war continuing. It says that Ukraine is running low on manpower, conscripting draft evaders. This article is another one from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that the Financial Times reports that Kiev is quickly depleting Ukraine's pool of young men to conscript into its army. To add to its ranks, Kiev has set up checkpoints to catch potential draft evaders. The outlet says Ukraine is struggling to train its soldiers and has begun drafting young men who were previously qualified for medical waivers. So I know the average age of Ukrainian soldiers is like 46 or something now. It goes to show the human toll of this war. And it is just, we don't know the death toll just because that's a strange thing about this war is both sides are not saying how many of their soldiers have been killed for propaganda purposes. I know the estimates of Ukrainian dead are in the hundreds of thousands. One day we will probably know the real toll. And again, all for what? And now the U.S. and the other Western countries are actually starting to think about winding this thing down as they're committing to the war in Gaza and looking ahead to a future war with a future war with China. And speaking of which, the next story here, China calls the U.S. a disruptor of peace in the South China Sea. So China called the U.S. the biggest disruptor of peace in the South China Sea after a U.S. warship sailed near Chinese-controlled islands in the disputed waters. The U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet said Saturday that the guided missile destroyer USS Hopper sailed near the Paracel Islands, known as the Shisha Islands in China, in an operation known as the Freedom of Navigation Operations, what they call FONAPs. And the U.S. began regularly conducting FONAPs to challenge China's claims to the South China Sea in 2015. The area where the USS Hopper conducted the FONAP is also claimed by Taiwan and Vietnam. The Chinese military said that it warned off the U.S. warship after it entered the Paracel Islands territorial waters, which extend 12 nautical miles from the coastline. So that's pretty close. When they do these FONAPs, the U.S. Navy gets pretty close to these islands claimed by China that are controlled by China, that are much closer to China than the Chinese mainland than the United States. China, of course, condemned this. And the U.S. has been doing this pretty frequently since 2015. But lately, just from following it myself over the past few years, China's condemned it much more strongly. They're getting really fed up with the U.S. military activity in the region. The U.S. is trying to normalize this military activity. And they're increasing and encouraging allies to do the same. And on Friday, an Australian warship transited the Taiwan Strait, and now Australia and the Philippines are conducting joint patrols in the South China Sea for the first time. And this comes after the U.S. and the Philippines restarted joint patrols in the South China Sea last week. This is the name of the game for the U.S., building alliances against China in this region to prepare for this future war. They say it's to deter war. I say it makes war much more likely, especially with these encounters that we're having. The risk of accident just continues to rise. All right, so the last one here, Taiwan opposition parties in separate bids for presidential race. So the Taiwan's People's Party and the Kuomintang, the two opposition parties who are running candidates in the 2024 election, they failed to reach a deal to run a joint ticket, which is what they needed to do to have a chance at beating the ruling Democratic Progressive Party. It's what they needed to do based on the polls, but I think the polls have been pretty consistent in showing that the DPP will win if these two opposition parties run separate candidates, and that's what's going to happen now. And the DPP are, independence-minded, independence-leaning, very, they're not looking for good relations with the mainland, while the Kuomintang, the TPP, are much more mainland-friendly. So if the DPP wins after 8 years of their policies of, growing ties with the U.S., that's what they want to do. They want more military aid, more diplomatic support from the U.S. They've been moving in that direction for the past 8 years, much more so in the past 4 years. That's when things really ramped up in that direction. But if they win, that's vindication of what they've been doing, and I think they're going to, double down on it, and we might see more types of U.S. support for Taiwan that we thought unimaginable just a few years ago. So it's not good for the chances of war in the region. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from David Stockman, Reflections on Another Truce, Why There Is Still No Peace on Earth. One from Matthew Ho, Night Raids, Tear Gas, and Captivity. One from Doug Bandow, The Credibility Mirage. One from Ted Snyder, 4 Myths About Putin. And one from Trita Parsi, Israel-Hamas Deal, Talking versus Bombing Works. So that is it for me for today. You could always help us out by sharing the show, liking, subscribing on YouTube, Odyssey, Rumble, wherever you watch. Follow me on Twitter. Follow antiwar.com. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.